Hello and welcome to the Football Hipsters podcast. It's another interview. I am your host, Kris, and I'm doing my very best John Welsh impression today. Why, I hear you ask? Well, simple. We have a guest today, which I'll introduce to you shortly, and he's very much of the Italian persuasion, shall we say, or certainly in his chosen topic of discussion today. But John is not able to join us, so I am going to be filling in as best I possibly can, but it's a subject that interests me greatly as well, because of course I am a football geek. So without further ado, I shall introduce my guest at this time. It's Dominic Bliss of the Inside Lefty. Hello there, Dom.
Hello, how are you doing?
I am very well, and thank you very much for joining us today. You have written a book on a very interesting character and a pioneer, I think it's fair to say. Before we go into the sort of the general questions and whatnot, I would like you just to give us a bit of a background on whom you've written this book about and the reasons why.
Yeah, he is a pioneer. It's in the title. The book's called Erbstein, The Triumph and Tragedy of Football's Forgotten Pioneer. And it's about a Hungarian coach called Ernő Egri Erbstein, who was the architect of the Grande Torino side, that great Italian side, Torino, who dominated the SerieA for most of the 1940s. And then after winning 5 Scudetti on the trot, they died in a plane crash at Superga. Now, a lot of people know about the Superga plane crash. People know the basics, that there was this great Torino side, and that, it's obviously going to go down in history when one of the best teams in Europe is entirely wiped out in a plane crash. But Erbstein, the manager, is very little covered, and I think the reason that team, or one of the main reasons that team was so successful, is because he was such a forward-thinking coach. When you ally that to the fact that he survived the Holocaust during the war, when he was persecuted as a Jew in the Budapest Holocaust, you realise that you've got an extraordinary man on your hands. Someone who made waves in the football world, then was forced to fight for his life and his family's survival against unbelievable odds. To be honest, they all survived, and then he returned to Italy, took up his former job, and led the team to even greater levels than they'd ever achieved before. It is a triumphant tale, but it's a very tragic ending for a guy who's overcome so much to then, he couldn't challenge fate that one last time, and he and his side were lost in the plane crash.
It's a genuinely fascinating story, and obviously to a lot of our listeners, some have got their specific leagues they follow and certain teams they follow. But I think it's one of those stories that when you read about it and you listen about it, it really sort of grips you. And you, even if you're not necessarily a follower of Italian football, it's something that is fascinating. How did you come to hear of Erbstein and his story? What got you into that subject area, and what sort of created the interest to write this book?
Right, so probably like you guys and your listeners, I'm a big football geek, and I'm in my early 30s now, but from my mid-teens I started reading. There was that was the advent really of this era of football writing books about football, and all different subjects, and it was a really good way to find out about, not only the greats of the game, but the greats of the overseas game. And one of the books that I picked up probably when I was in my early 20s was Calcio by John Foote. It's effectively a history of the Italian game, and it goes into every detail: referees, scandals, the great sides, the provincial sides, historically successful sides, and those that were more quirky. And one of the sections was about the great managers. It talked about Sacchi and Trapattoni and all these kind of all these characters that you hear about all the time. And then Erbstein came up, and I thought, I've not heard of Erbstein. I know about the Grande Torino, but I'd never even considered that there would have been a manager. Obviously there would have been, but it just hadn't crossed my mind. And when I saw that he'd also survived the Holocaust, and it was only two sentences, 2 paragraphs at most, just mentioning the outline really, that Torino had won all these titles and played a new kind of football, and and that the manager had been a Holocaust survivor. I just thought, well, that's remarkable. You mean to have one of those things in your life story, you'd think you'd be remembered forever. To have both, it's amazing that nobody, including a football geek like myself, had any real knowledge of him. And I just thought, as a writer, it'd be interesting to look into it further, to flesh out the story, to find out the nuts and bolts of his life, and write an article about it. And the more I delved, the more I looked into it, the more I realised that there was more than an article in it. And I started thinking I could possibly do this justice by travelling, by meeting all the people in his life, by seeing the places that he affected, and where he managed, and where he survived, and see really what it would have been like. And there's a book in that, so that's what I did. It took me, because I wasn't able to just take a sabbatical and do it. It took me 5 years on and off, saving up for a trip here and there, paying researchers in various countries to dig into archives, and over the course of time, I eventually found that there would be an interest in this book. And the Blizzard, who I'm sure Football Hipsters podcast listeners will know about, the Blizzard Quarterly Journal, their editor Jonathan Wilson showed a very strong interest in publishing it. So then I was buoyed by that, and I really went to town and produced the book. So yeah, it was really a chance discovery. I was reading a book on the train to work, and something pricked my interest, and I just couldn't let it alone. I went into every different aspect of his life and decided to bring it out in a book.
And a wonderful story it is to bring out a book on, absolutely. And we'll certainly drill down into the story in a short while as well. And you should say, of course, your website, theinsideleft.com, is that all completely all of your own work, or do you have sort of other writers that join you on that as well?
There are other writers on there. It's been dormant for about 6 months now, which is just a sign of getting busy in other areas of my professional life. But for the last few years, we've been running some really interesting football stories on there, often in the ilk of Erbstein, really, these stories that have been forgotten, things that people have a little bit of a hint of knowledge of, but don't really know the full story. So it's one of those websites where you'll get to know more about something you know a little of, and very much enjoyed running it. So yeah, I think the majority of the articles, I would say it's about 50-50 split between my own work and guest contributors, and we've had some really top guys on there over the time. So it's a treasure trove, I like to think, and it's all there still on theinsideleft.com. We haven't taken the site down. Perhaps one day I'll go back to putting more regular contributions on there.
Yeah, check it out, people. I know from running a website and podcasts and everything myself, it's sometimes time just gets in the way. I know exactly how you feel. Let's go back to the book then. So with Erbstein himself, how much of an innovator was he? I mean, I myself and a lot of the hipster crew that made up this podcast, we're Arsenal fans, so obviously we're quite well versed in the Herbert Chapman sort of side of things. So Erbstein sounds like a very similar character in the way that he was that innovator. How would you sort of describe what you know of what he did in that era?
I think without the depth, so just talking structurally and tactically, he was really similar to Erbstein. I think as a character, he was very different. So Erbstein and Chapman, similarities were that Chapman was probably the first, because English football at that time, domestically, certainly club football, was ahead of the game, and the rest of Europe. And Chapman being in the 20s and 30s, I should say, and that's when Erbstein was playing and beginning to manage. Chapman brought in the WM, which is effectively putting three defenders when they used to play 2-3-5 like a pyramid. He decided to bring one of the midfield players back in and make him a centre back, and that changed the way that everyone played football from then on. It became a more tactical game. You had to unpick defences. The offside trap changed around that time, so it was not two defenders but one that played them onside, And so everything became a little bit more strategic, and Chapman's credited, rightly so, with those changes, but also structurally at the club at Arsenal, he was a manager in the sense that we became familiar with. You know, he wasn't just a coach. He wasn't just a secretary. You know, he was actually planning for years in advance. You know, bring in certain sorts of players, look at developing a style of play, changing kit, changing other elements. You know, medical science came into it. So there were all these tentacles of the modern football club. And Torino, under Ferruccio Novo, president who took over in the late 30s, decided they wanted to be the Italian pioneers of that sort of structuring of the club. And he'd seen Erbstein was doing brilliant work at lesser clubs, most notably Lucchese, who he took up from the equivalent of the third division in Italy, where they were struggling and they were just a going concern, really. He took them up in 4 seasons. He took them up twice, and then they were finishing 7th in SerieA, above the likes of Inter and Roma. So he was doing very well. He was probably the most revered coach in Italy at the time, other than maybe the national team manager who'd won 2 World Cups, Pozzo. And he was brought in by Torino as the guy who was going to spearhead this operation, because he had the tactical know-how. He had this reputation. He was described in one of the papers quite early in his career as, you know, a professor of football. He would have been, if there was a course in football as a science course, you know, he would have been the professor. He'd have been the one writing the papers that changed the way we looked at it, because he was a philosopher as well. So yeah, Arsenal fans could probably really appreciate that, because there would have been the similarities with Chapman structurally, the similarities with Wenger philosophically. You know, if you imagine merging Chapman and Wenger, I don't think that's an exaggeration either. You might be looking at something similar to Erbstein, although, you know, he obviously went his own way and didn't manage in England. But there was those similarities, the charisma and the charm that maybe someone like Mourinho in his early years showed as well. It really isn't an exaggeration to say that he combined all of those elements. And I mean, you only have to look at how he did. If you take a team up to promotion 2 years in a row and then 7th in SerieA from nowhere, and then you take the top job and win everything every year, you're clearly very good at what you do. And we never will know what he could have gone on to do had he not been, first of all, lost all those years to the war, and second of all, had he not died in a plane crash.
Yeah, that's the sad part, isn't it? And as you make reference to that was what gripped me. I heard your interview on TalkSport 2, and that was what sort of really gripped me, the comparisons with like the modern day innovators. And as you say, as an Arsenal fan, I really identified with the comparisons to Chapman and the similarity. You mentioned the spell at Lucchese, which is sort of what got him noticed. Do you feel that was the only thing that got him noticed, or do you think that there was other things going on, maybe in the way or the style of play, or was it just purely the performances he was getting out of that Lucchese side?
Well, in those days, people would have to go to other grounds to ingratiate themselves with owners and managers and coaches of other clubs. You know, there wasn't the media for someone to see someone interviewed on the telly and go, he's impressive. And Erbstein really was keen on that. He would go and travel and watch other teams play and make sure that he knew what was coming, what sort of tactics were being implemented by the top teams and by upcoming opponents. But while he was there, he'd also shake hands and talk football with the guys who ran those clubs. So he was known in the circuit as an incredibly knowledgeable man, and he was always the one who held his own in conversations about football. And I think owners or presidents, of Italian clubs in general wanted Erbstein to manage their team. So even from an early stage, he started off at Bari, and then he managed Nocerina and Cagliari, and then went back to Bari. And he was sacked by Bari in controversial circumstances where they weren't doing too badly, and they couldn't have expected to do too well in SerieA. But there seemed to be a few people that were angling to get rid of him, and the press discussed things that were pretty, unbecoming, really. Someone mentioned alcohol as one of the reasons, and they wrote the article under an anonymous name. It just said the article was written by a guy called Vice. And another article appeared a day or two later by a local correspondent called Enzo Martella, who had actually had access to Erbstein. And he said, the guy's total. It's just a total fabrication. The reason that they didn't like him was because he was going around to other clubs and talking to other people, but he was just mingling. He was just a football man, to use that phrase. He wanted to see what was going on. He wanted to develop new ways of thinking about the game, and he liked passing on his knowledge to others. He was like a teacher. So he was really well known. Some people didn't like it, some people did like it, and it meant that getting jobs was not really a problem for him. He's pictured in one of the papers when he took Ligué to SerieA, and he's sort of looking into the middle distance and leaning on a fence by the side of a training pitch, looking, like he bestrides this club, which he did. And the article said he was enjoying his 15 minutes of fame. People wanted his autograph. People wanted to speak to him. I think that made some people jealous. It made others stand up and take notice. And it made Novo at Torino sit up and take notice. And he wanted him at his club. He thought, imagine what he could do with the infrastructure of a top club like Torino. And Novo was a young president. Novo was ambitious. He was another guy who went around to other clubs and looked at top players, and they were like a dream team, really. He even kept the job open for him when he was forced to leave the country because of fascist, anti-Semitic persecution. His president, who's very much part of the mainstream in Italy, has said to him, you're my guy. I don't care about all of this. I want you back. And they talked on the phone from long distance, from Budapest to Turin during the war. This is how much people valued Erbstein's knowledge, that even when he was forced to leave the country at a time when mass communication was very difficult, they did everything they could to keep in touch with him, to hear what he thought they should do. And there's talk of incognito scouting trips back to Italy, which was very dangerous during the war, where he spotted players like Valentino Mazzola and Ezio Loic playing for Venezia, and Novo wanted him to watch them and see what he thought. So it really is incredible. He was so well valued. It all started at Lucchese, like you say, but he wasn't, even though the club was provincial, he wasn't out of the spotlight. He was known.
Yeah. And I suppose, like, when you look at his playing career, because obviously he played in, like you say, Budapest, and played in Italy, and also had a spell in the USA as well with Brooklyn Wanderers, a brilliantly named Brooklyn Wanderers. Love reading that.
Well, that's actually a classic Wikipedia error, which I'd hoped might be changed in reference to the book.
See, this is why you're the expert and we are not, you say.
he toured the USA. This is fascinating. He toured the USA with a team called the Maccabees, who were just put together by a Jewish businessman called Nate Agar, who owned a club called Brooklyn Wanderers in the American League. And he was jealous that a club called Hakoah Vienna had toured. They were the best team in Austria at the time. They had players like Bela Gutmann, who went on to become a great manager himself. They toured the USA, Hakoah Vienna, and they got record crowds. They were filling stadiums on the East Coast because the sort of Jewish diaspora meant that there was loads of people in America who were interested to see Jewish sportsmen, even from Central Europe, from the old world, if you like. And Nate Agar decided that he wanted a piece of the action. He'd missed out on, this was his circuit. What was he doing? He'd missed a chance. So he put together his own team called the Maccabees, and he approached Erbstein to lead that tour, to be the captain. So he was kind of playing for a sort of invitational touring side, but they were run by the same people as Brooklyn Wanderers.
Interesting. See, I'm almost glad that I'm always glad that was incorrect information, because we would never have learned the truth otherwise.
He took some stuff to America. They were writing in the press at the time, we haven't seen football like this before. This pattern weaving play, this the passing game, effectively, that they hadn't really seen in America, because they played an exaggerated version of the direct game played in Britain because of pitches, because the makeup of the team was largely British. Suddenly they had people from Central Europe, which is the home of what we probably called the birthplace of what we now call tiki-taka, Hungary and Austria. This is where in the 30s people were playing neat passing football, overlapping, someone actually putting the ball in space and running onto it. This was a very different way of playing. It's futuristic. And so they were amazed at what they were seeing. The American audience were amazed. But Erbstein, his teammates were all saying, this is antediluvian football. This is prehistoric. What are we up against here? We can't even, they were struggling to beat these teams that were playing muscly long ball game. And they were saying they're playing this kind of basic football, but we're having trouble with it. And they were really disheartened by that. They thought, is this the future of the game? What's happening? Whereas Erbstein went away and thought about it. And that was one of the elements he introduced as a manager in Italy. He wrote in a diary piece in one of the papers in the 30s in Italy, that he'd seen in America this way of coping with a stronger opponent. Okay, the team that we're playing against better than us, but we can put the ball, into channels and put a powerful front man and chase it. He actually took on elements of the British and American school and took them to places like Bari, who were struggling in SerieA, and they could try and get results against the top teams in Italy by effectively playing a direct style, by being compact and playing long. So yeah, he learned from everything. He took everything in. He didn't get disheartened by losing to a long ball team. He thought, I can take that and build on it.
It's just, as you say, like you said, the modern day where it seems everybody is coming up with new ideas, but it's almost like, as you say, he created the ideas for people to have fresh ideas almost, that's the idea that he can take it and make his own way and then pave the way for others to change the way that teams play. That's just, you just can't imagine that happening in the modern day, can you? Just so many people copy each other and then away they go. And of course, a lot of coaches nowadays seem to just go, well, that works for them, and we'll go with that. See the English national side for that one. This is a really interesting question with regards to the era in Italy at the time he was there. It was an era of no foreign players, and some of our listeners may be aware of that, but if not, just explain what was going on there and how was he accepted by other clubs and media at that time, where it was it was a zero foreigners rule playing wise, and it was very much an unknown thing at the time.
Well, yeah, the fascist state under Mussolini in the 20s and 30s permeated society. So they would look to change the structure of all, I suppose, associations, whether they're sporting, cultural, whatever they were. They wanted them to fit this idea as the corporate state. That's what Italy was at the time. Corporate as in from the Latin corpus for body. So everything fitted a structure, hierarchical. And he had this idea that football should be the same. And that's why we've got in Italy now a more structured footballing system. So one of the few positive things to come out of that was that they sorted out the football structure to make it modernised. It wasn't provincialised, wasn't regionalised. It was SerieA, Serie B, and then below that you had the provincial league. So that was one of the things. But they also changed lots of other things for the worse. There was this idea that Italian people should be the best. So we should be able to have our boys showing sporting excellence and inspiring the next generation. They're like soldiers in peacetime, aren't they? Athletes to a fascist, and that's certainly how Mussolini viewed it. And he wanted his national league to only be made up of Italian players, but he wasn't so dumb as to think that he couldn't change the reference point for what an Italian was. So anyone with Italian heritage was welcomed back in. So lots of South American players whose grandparents or parents had left Italy and gone abroad, even people from Central Europe, they were welcomed back in and they were called Italian. So you had great Argentinians playing for these Italian clubs, but they were called Italian now. They were Oriundi, reclaimed Italians. Erbstein wasn't one of them. Erbstein was a Hungarian guy of Jewish origin. So he wasn't allowed to play when the law was changed. So he played 2 or 3 years in Italy in the early to mid-20s, and then it was, sorry, mate, you can't play anymore. He was never that good anyway. He was a lower league player. He played in the equivalent of Serie B and Serie C in Italy. And he only played briefly in the top flight in Hungary. He was quite a technically adept player, but he didn't shine. And so I think he saw it as an opportunity after that tour of America. He quite fancied trying his hand as a coach, and he'd been inspired by seeing different ways and by leading a squad out there on a tour. He went back to Italy and he managed, because you could have foreign managers. They had a law where if you could show that you'd exhausted all options of getting a local manager, you could in those circumstances bring in a foreign manager. Everyone just took advantage of that loophole. So there were loads of foreign managers. There were Hungarians and Austrians at some of the top clubs. Arpad Weisz was Inter and Bologna manager, and they won the league with both those clubs. And he later was forced to leave Italy because he was of Jewish origin, and he died in Auschwitz. So there were lots of people who came to Italy to work as coaches who wouldn't have been allowed to play. It was a very strange setup. It was just like most of those kind of cultural laws in fascist Italy. It was very inconsistent, and I'm not the expert on that, but it seemed to me like people were able to find loopholes and work around things. I suppose you didn't have computer data to track down and check up on these inconsistencies. So if you could find a loophole at the time and write a letter to the right person, get permission, then it was done. It was fine. So yeah, that was how he managed to get work as a manager, and he wasn't alone.
It's amazing to think, isn't it? Like, you think of how many foreign players that we have, obviously here in the UK in the Premier League, and of course throughout Europe's top leagues, and indeed even now some of the lesser leagues. It's just full of foreign players, and you cannot imagine how that would have been, or how it would be if somebody tried to replicate that in the modern day. Of course they couldn't, due to various different rights, but just the thought of it is it's bizarre, isn't it? Really, really is bizarre.
Well, yeah, I mean, even at that time, one of the reasons they did that was because there was alarm among nationalist Italians that there were so many foreign players, and they were upset about it. And I think a lot of them were brought in as stars, so they were bringing in a star striker from Austria or Hungary or something, and that irritated people like Mussolini and some of the others in the fascist party. So I think that was one of the reasons, really. It was just this impatience to see more Italian heroes.
Yeah, it's something that, as you say, it's just such a rare commodity, and going back, it's a fascinating thing to pick up on. And speaking of the fascinating, the Grande Torino side that we sort of know and love, or would look back on now and say wow, because obviously a lot of people in the modern era would look at the quote unquote the fashionable clubs in Italy, I suppose. Torino are one of the old-fashioned legends, if you will, the people that or the club that somebody would have to really look up to realise how great a history they've got. That side was full of young talent. How do you, or do indeed you see any similarities to what the current Torino are looking to do? Because they were absolutely full of just prime young talent in that era.
Yeah, I think at that time there wasn't such a there was a divide, but there wasn't such a divide between the haves and the have-nots in Italian football. So Torino they were one of the big clubs at the time anyway, but they were able to set themselves a target of becoming the top side by structuring themselves the right way and picking up players on the cheap, or people who'd been discarded here and there, or young up-and-coming players. And that's what the Grande Torino was made up of. There were only maybe one or two established stars in that, which would have been Guglielmo Gabetto, who came from Juventus, and Eusebio Castigliano was an experienced player as well. But most of the others were seen as we'll bring them in because they're doing well at lesser clubs, or they've been discarded by the top club. So that was how they looked at doing things. And now this Torino, there is a bigger gap. So I don't think they can set themselves a target being the top side in Italy anymore. But they can do the 21st century version, which is, can we try and break into the teams that qualify for Europe? Can we challenge that elite? And if we're well run, maybe we can. Since Umberto Cairo's been president there, they had the current Italy manager Gigi Ventura as coach. They've gone up from Serie B, organised themselves to stay in SerieA, signed a mixture of experienced players who are on the way down and young players who are on the way up. And they got themselves into Europe, did well. And then they were sort of maybe going back in the other direction last season towards mid-table. But what they've done is they've refreshed the squad, and they've got Mihailovic as manager now, and they've got young players in a similar way to the Grande Torino from lesser clubs. So Baselli and Zappa Costa have come in this time around from Atalanta. Benassi was considered not ready to play for Inter, so they signed him. He'd had a loan spell at Livorno, they liked him, they signed him. Benassi's the captain and the key midfield player. Valdefiori had done well for Empoli, really well, got into the Italy squad, moved to Napoli with Sarri when he moved from Empoli to Napoli, and couldn't get in the team. I think he had injuries, he had problems settling, and Torino said, well, we'll bring you back. So they've got a midfield made up of these excellent Italian players who, for one reason or another, either haven't reached the top yet or didn't quite make it when they did. And that's not even getting on to Andrea Belotti up front, who Torino fans wouldn't thank me for talking about and building the noise around him, because you fear that he'll be the next Immobile or Cerci who does well for Torino and then they lose him and they've got to find another one. So, but they've got all these excellent young Italian players, and it's really exciting to watch. Barreca came through the youth system there, the left back, and he's been a revelation. He's only played a handful of games and he's already being talked about as, in teams of the week in Italy, and he's in the Italy under-21 squad. So they look for all the world like they're using that same template, but the structure of Italian football is different now. The odds are loaded against them anyway. They can't suddenly take on these types of players and then say we're going to take on Juventus and go to the top of the pile. What they can do is maybe target fifth or sixth, or if they get on a run, maybe a little bit higher and see what they can do from there. But no doubt they'll lose those players at the moment they do that, because they'll go somewhere where they can earn more.
Yeah, sold on at high profit. I must admit, I'm a huge fan of Belotti. Just when he started breaking through, I just saw something in him and thought, yeah, he's one to watch. So I'm glad it's working out for him. With regards to sort of having a look at what Erbstein did, and obviously it would be an unfair question to say who do you think or could anyone replicate what he did, because obviously it's impossible given the different circumstances. But is there any coach or coaches or setups that you could see in the modern era that could even come close to replicating some of the things that he was able to achieve? Is there anyone that you look at and think, yeah, that's somebody on the similar path?
Blimey, that is difficult. Yeah, because the thing with Erbstein was that he started and worked his way up. He started at clubs that were lesser lights and worked his way up, and he did sort of did his time, if you like, in the lower leagues. And he was happy to stay with clubs as long as they were happy to keep him. He had to leave Lucchese because of persecution against Jews. So he moved to Turin, which was a bit more cosmopolitan, a bit more welcoming, and even then he had to go and come back after the war. So he had these kind of unique set of circumstances that he was fighting against on the side. But as a coach, he was always looking to innovate rather than to see. He wasn't just looking at what was coming through. He was looking at what was coming through and how he could better it, rather than just replicating it. I think maybe the only people that reminds me of this sort of high pressing coaches that see that that's catching on, and they're trying to see how they can take it to the next level. So you might look at someone like Thomas Tuchel or someone like Eddie Howe, who's come up through the lower leagues and done what with Bournemouth, who also play in red and black stripes, what he did with Lucchese in the same kit. You never know. Someone might take a chance on Eddie Howe and say, rebuild this great club for us. That kind of thing, and Pochettino, I suppose, is another one like that. So these kind of managers who see what the latest trend is, or who learn from people like Bielsa or Juan Manuel Lillo or Guardiola, even Klopp. They look at those coaches who had started a movement, and then they look to supersede it. How can we do better than it? And they do that with lesser clubs and then bigger clubs. They're happy to look at young players who are unknown and say he could fit in perfectly to this team. I'm going to bring him in. So those are the kind of managers I think that Erbstein would have been most similar to if he was around now.
That's very, very good answer. I appreciate that was a tough question. I know our John, who's not with us today, is a big fan of Eusebio Di Francesco at SAS as well, and sort of the similarity of a coach trying to take a smaller club to a next level, although they didn't have a very good day-to-day at time of recording. But no,
Mihajlovic at Torino is not a million miles. I mean, he's much more authoritarian. Erbstein was more avuncular. He was a teacher on the training pitch, but off the pitch he was like their friend. He put an arm around the shoulder and what's the matter? What can we do to make you happy? And he would make little notes, individual notes on his desk about players that needed help. And he wrote one on there that just said, "Teach Ballerin to smile," because his right back Aldo Ballerin was known to be such a serious guy, and so he had like a daily task to make him smile. That make sure of that. That's the kind of man management focus he had. So non-authoritarian, but Mihajlovic, in terms of the way that he expects so much from his club, that he doesn't say, we can't do better than that. He says, I want the stadium full this weekend for the game against Lazio because we're going somewhere here and I want the fans to come along with us. And I can imagine Erbstein saying something similar. So that reasonable expectation that most managers have, putting that to one side and saying, no, we can go a bit further than that. In that respect, Mihajlovic is a bit like him.
Yeah, it's such a key part of modern management, isn't it? Especially when players are so extra sensitive as well, and what goes on around them off the pitch as well as on it with the management level. It's got to be on a really personal level. I find I don't think you can get away with being just a shouty, ranty coach anymore. It doesn't seem to work. So. No, he's definitely an interesting point. Before we close off, I just want to give you just an opportunity to tell us anything else that we haven't asked question wise. Anything else that you want to bring up, particularly about the book writing process and anything that you might be looking to bring up that we haven't covered. So, anything else that really took your interest when you were writing the book?
Well, I suppose I've stuck to talking about football, but there's probably a good section of the book which covers how he went about surviving the Holocaust, which was the most kind of, I suppose, emotional bit to research and to write, and it was very difficult to pull together accounts from such a chaotic period and to try and do it sensitively. And that was probably the biggest challenge in the book. I also think when you read the book back, you realise what on earth people were up against at that time, and what a terrible, terrible time it was to be on the wrong side of fascism, of Nazism. And I think that really, when you see that sets in perspective what he achieved as a football manager, because you realise then that he was able to compartmentalise things, that unspeakable things that he'd gone through, and return and manage a football team successfully. So the strength of spirit, the strength of mind, the psychological aspect, I haven't really covered today. It's there. It's there throughout the book. I tried to build a sense of this is the background, because this is what shapes the man. And so it's a slow build. You read the book in chronological order, and you'll realise as you go along that what I'm trying to do is form the shape of the man, the life that he led, that made him such a great coach, and all that he went through. He survived 2 wars, because he fought in the First World War as well, and being told he can't do this and can't do that as a citizen and as a footballer, and constantly coming back because he had the intellect to do so, constantly regenerating, constantly being optimistic. These are the factors that it's hard to bring across in a spoken interview. I hope that if you read the book, you'll see that he was an indefatigable character, someone who just didn't give up.
It's an incredibly difficult thing to cover, I would imagine. I can't even begin to think of how I would go about it. So all credit to you for covering that. Of course, it's not something you can skip over, but even so, the way to write it must be really, really difficult. We'll wrap it there then for the interview. It's been genuinely fascinating. Of course, we want to give you a platform to let everybody know where they can purchase the book, and indeed anything else that you want to plug, because this is your open forum, and of course where people can follow you, because I'm sure there'll be more work coming.
Well, yeah, the best place to pick up the book is on the Blizzard website. So the blizzard.co.uk. Go to the shop section. There's a drop-down menu at the top for shop, and then Blizzard Books. And on there, you've got the opportunity to buy it as a hard copy or as a digital copy. But you can also get the digital copy on Kindle from the Amazon website if you prefer. But yeah, going to the Blizzard is the best place to get it because then Amazon won't take their cut, which is great for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
But they're the two places, and yeah, I hope there's more to come. I'm working on a couple of things for the setpieces.com at the moment, and I work a bit with Howler magazines, the American magazine. So little things to come, more historical forgotten stories, and you can follow me on Twitter at the Inside Lefty, which is basically the inside left with a Y on the end, because I thought it would be funny to give it a football style nickname, which you may or may not agree was a good idea for brand recognition. But it's at the Inside Lefty on Twitter. But yeah, thanks for having me on. And it's a very serious topic to talk about, so I often end up rambling, and you can come across a little bit intense, but it's one of those subjects. It is intense. It's like reading a Russian novel. You know, you're in there and you're gripped by all the different outside elements that come to inflict themselves on him. And I'm not saying I can write like a Russian novelist there, by the way, but yeah, it's got all those elements, and I hope that I've done it justice, because the story itself had those elements before I'd even touched it.
Yeah. No, I think you haven't. I must admit, I haven't started. I have made the step to put it onto my wanted list of books to purchase, and you feel honoured because I very rarely read. Sounds like I'm not educated. I do like reading, but I'm more of an audiobook person or a podcast person. So it takes a lot for me to want to read a book, but yours is definitely one that I do want to. So fantastic! Really, really appreciate your time. And if you ever want to come back on, if you want to talk about any other subjects that might be close to your heart, football-wise as well, you're always welcome. But that was our great thanks to Dominic for coming on. We really appreciate it. And as usual, you can follow our podcast at the FH Pods, and you can subscribe, of course, to all of our new content on SoundCloud, iTunes, YouTube, wherever you see fit. Really, we'll drop our information into there every week. So please feel free. But thanks again, Dom. We really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Cheers.
No worries. And thanks to our listeners, as usual, obviously on this podcast. Keep your beard strong and your glasses trendy, and we'll be back very soon.